Good evening. Welcome to St Crispin's. Thank you very much indeed for coming and helping us to work out how to make our ends meet over the next few years. My name's Andy Caldrick. I'm the Chief Executive of Wokingham Borough Council. Before I say more about how the evening is going to work for us, I'm going to invite Councillor Keith Baker, the leader of Wokingham Borough Council, to say a few words.
Can you all hear me without using this?
Yeah.
Okay. Save some electricity, maybe.
That's a challenge to all of us now.
Well, thank you all for turning up tonight. Some of you may know, or some of you may not know, this is the first time Wokingham Borough Council has ever tried doing anything like this, where we are asking our residents across 5 locations of the borough to give us comments and help us make the savings that are being forced on us. Other authorities around Wokingham do different things. Most of them do a survey up on their website. We looked at that and decided that was inappropriate. We wanted to do more. We wanted to have a dialogue, one-to-one conversations, rather than restricting you to a set of questions and a set of answers to provide the data that's coming through. I'm going to hand over to Andy in a minute, but I just want to mention, I'm sure you've seen the camera here on your right. It's only ever going to be pointing this way, so you will not be on the ultimate video that will be up on our website. So don't worry about that. I know on a recent Street Life thread there is a whole host of people, about 5 or 6 people, who were getting quite paranoid, quite rightly, that it was infringing, I think it was Article 8 of the Human Rights Act, which I think they're true. So without further ado, thank you very, very much for coming. I'll pass over to him.
Thank you very much. I very much hope we're all able to leave the building tonight without any of our human rights having been infringed in any way. Graham Evers, who I'll introduce, who is the Director for Finance and Resources in the Council, is going to, with me, lead you through a short presentation, a series of slides that tries to set the context for the evening. The format is a short presentation, after which you'll be invited to drift around the room, as some of you already have, where you will find stalls and officers of the council and a number of elected members representing the large chunks of activity the council's responsible for. To my right, your left, is the Health and Wellbeing Service. In the far corner is the Environment Services. In the opposite corner is our governance and support activity, the things in the back office that keep the council going. And on this side of the room, Children's Services. So there are officers on each of those stalls able to answer your questions, respond to your challenges, and encourage you to offer up any suggestions that you have. And this evening is about hoovering up your ideas, helping you go away, we hope, informed about the budget, how we put the budget together, how the budget's changed over a period of time, and how it continues to look likely to change. To understand more perhaps about the range of services that we are responsible, whether in statute or through local democratic mandate, to go on delivering. And then to have been able to help us with the challenge that we face, which isn't a one-year challenge, it's a challenge over a number of years. Has been over a number of years in the recent past and continues to be going forward. When you've asked all that you want to ask, said all that you want to say, scribbled as many post-it notes as you want to, you are of course free to leave. And we thank you very much for coming. The results of your labours we will capture, as we will all of the events, and publish them on the council's website. So they're available in terms of the suggestions and proposals that you made and the responses that we make to those. So we hope this will be as transparent a process going forward as we can make it. So that's the format for the evening. I shall press buttons, hopefully in the right points. And, oh, he's got his own button pressing. I'm redundant. Thank you and good night. I'll hand over to Graham.
Good evening. I was actually quite looking forward to using the microphone, but if you can hear me, I will also proceed without one. What we thought was really important for this evening, for you to be able to engage as fully as you can, is to understand the financial context of Wokingham Borough Council. Basically, the money that we receive, what we spend it on for your services. And I'll start with the slide that shows our 4 key pots of money. Down here, the smallest pot is the housing revenue account. So that's about our council housing stock, the tenants that we have in that stock, and they pay rental income. We receive about £16 million per annum, and we spend that money on housing revenue account activities for those tenants. And there's clear rules and regulations around that, which means we must spend that income in that particular area. So we can't casually use that money for any other purposes. So you may be here as a housing tenant, and that will be interesting to know in terms of your income goes there, that's what you pay, and it's spent on housing revenue account activities. Moving to capital. Some of you may be in the facility of what we call strategic development locations, whereby housing are being built up, and you may be aware that the developers who are building the houses are making significant capital contributions to the council. And you may be thinking, why hasn't the council got an awful lot of money to spend, and why is it having pressures in terms of its council tax? Well, the money that it receives from developers has to be spent on the infrastructure requirements caused by that development. There's also other items of income that go in towards our capital investment priorities, which includes capital receipts we get from disposals or borrowing, or indeed government grants. But they're all very clearly prescribed, and we must spend that income on the purposes that that money was given. And primarily that's to build our schools, our roads, and whatever other infrastructures needed around that community. And that costs an awful lot of money. A big road costs about £30 million. A big school costs £30 to £40 million. So that money very easily gets absorbed and used for those purposes. Then we have another significant area up here called the Dedicated Schools Grant, and that is very clearly prescribed as well. That's over £100 million grant from the government, but it can only be used on schools. And that's a significant amount of money. It's very clearly prescribed. It must be passed on to schools, or if it's retained and held back, it must be used for services to support schools. Which brings me on to the main purpose of us being here, the general fund, which has a gross expenditure of £169 million per annum. So it's a serious business. And that's pretty much, the general fund is pretty much everything else that isn't housing, isn't capital, and isn't schools. So that will be what you might see up here as health and well-being. So it's the adult social care costs, children's services, caring for children, your children that may be in need of care, or you know someone who's in need of care. Same with our demographic elderly population. We also have in ongoing expenditure, waste collection, waste disposal. All these are key areas of activity, highways, ongoing highways maintenance. These are our ongoing contractual costs, our salary costs, and whatever else in terms of needed to allow those ongoing services to be delivered to yourselves in the community. And it's that bubble there that we want to focus on tonight, because that is funded by your council tax, and it's really, these are the decisions that we need to struggle with in terms of reduced money and increasing demands on the service. So we'll move in from that £169 million per annum. We'll then dissect that in the next slide. So that's that £169 million. And it's funded by, almost half of it is funded by council tax. So that's your council tax pays for that. Also next sizable chunk is specific grants and contributions. These are things like the public health grant that must be spent on public health activities, for example. And we receive other specific grants from the government that must be spent on those specific activities. So they're not freely available to move across all sorts of council services. 18% is the government support, that's our main government grant that we receive, and 10% comes from fees and charges. Fees and charges are predominantly from adult social care full cost recovery and all those activities in terms of recovering our income where we can for our high cost adult social care services, and also in terms of car parking charges. So car parking charges is another significant part of that. But they are the two most significant elements within fees and charges. Of course, there's all sorts of trivial ones around car boot sales and fishing licences, and some that are set on a statutory basis, which we have no control over. But you'll see they make up a small but significant contribution in terms of the overall council's finances. Now, moving on to the £113 million chart here, you'll say, well, what's the difference? So that 169, the fees and charges, like car parking charges, and the specific grants, like the public health grant, are usually shown within services. So they're not freely available, they go directly into the services. And then we're effectively left with government support and council tax that pays for our net budget requirement. So it's kind of like the figure at the bottom that we arrive at to say, well, how much is the council tax level that we need to levy? So it's that 113 million we quite often look at, having incorporated the fees and charges and the specific grants into the calculation. We land up with that 113 million position there. And this is a really important comparison. First of all, that's telling us that less than a quarter of our net budget income comes from government support. And that is the lowest in the country. So we receive the lowest grant per head of population in the whole of the country. And that's how that translates through. It means that overall, our overall spending is funded by less than a quarter of that grant. And it means that we're highly dependent on council tax. Because of that history of being so poorly funded from the government, we are already a very lean organisation. So we have a workforce of about 1,000 people, 1,000 full-time equivalent, which is an extremely low ratio when compared with other local organisations. What it's also worth saying is that government support, that's such a low ratio, means that the impact of increases in council tax are much more significant for Wokingham Borough Council than they are any other council in the country, because our gearing is so dependent on increases in council tax. So it impacts Wokingham more than anywhere else because we are so dependent. Although I've given that average position of half of funding, this is taking the average unitary authority, half from the government, half from council tax. Although that's an average position, you can imagine the extreme opposite to Wokingham is pretty much 3/4 funded by government grant and 1/4 by council tax. So you can see the pressures at Wokingham are quite extreme in terms of its baseline funding. We're not starting the journey here in terms of austerity. This isn't the first time we've had to apply our minds to how we cut our cloth to the reduced money that we have available. And from 2011-12, which was the response of the first measures of austerity, we have built up cumulative savings of £31.3 million, which is 27% of the net budget or 18% of gross budget. So either way you look at that, that's pretty significant. So year on year, we've had to achieve in the region of £6 to £8 million worth of savings and efficiencies in order to balance our books.
Sorry, could you just expand again? Are you saying that each year added up separately comes to 30 million, or are you saying that the 31 million is an annual rate, which includes savings from previous? So
yes, yeah, I understand the question, thank you. It means that in 2015-16, we have achieved 31.3 million of reoccurring annual savings.
So that's actually impacting on the year?
Every year. So
no, what we're saying is our budgets in 2015 will be 31 million higher, or are we saying it will be 8 million higher?
Right, sorry, yes. What this is saying is that in the first year, we had to take 6.5 million out of the budget, so that's less money. Then, and that's ongoing, so it's ongoing expenditure that comes out of the budget. In the next year, we have a similar size challenge, which means we now have a cumulative ongoing 11 million out of the budget, and so on and so forth. So by the time we get to 2015-16, our ongoing baseline, 31.3 million, has come out of the base budget.
Does this mean it's very inefficient at the start then?
Well, you can certainly, well, isn't this how any businesses respond to reduces in income or trade? So we've had, and I'll come to the next slide, which explains how we've had to respond. But I would have said, even comparatively, I mean, when we ask the question, well, are we efficient or inefficient, then one of our first places of going is to benchmark against other authorities. Even back in 11-12, we would have had relatively much smaller headcounts, much smaller spend per head of population than our neighbouring boroughs and indeed the average unitary. So in terms of one way of answering the question, were we inefficient in 11-12, is not particularly according to the benchmarking that we had and looked at that time. However, we've had to respond over the years in order to balance our books and meet the financial challenge.
Just a point, I can think of very few companies that would make that type of saving because they would just not have the capacity to do that. I'm surprised that you could save a third of your overall budget if it wasn't fairly fast in the first place. I mean, it just seems an incredible amount of money to save.
Yes, which one could look at in a positive way in terms of rising to the challenge. So I'll come to how we've done it on the next slide, but it's good that we're challenging about where we were to begin with and how we've gone about it. And this is how we've gone about it, because we recognise that we have to take a very responsible approach to those cuts in spending. And we don't want that to impact on your services, the ones that you receive in the community. So we've looked as best we can, taking the first one. We've looked at staffing, and 22% of that challenge has come out of our staffing reduction initiatives. We had a transformation programme whereby we took out 10% of our staffing. On the one hand, you could have said, well, therefore it was fat in the first place, but our benchmarking didn't say that. But we've had to be really, really diligent about how we've re-engineered our staffing in order to take 10% out of our overall establishment. Furthermore, quite recently, we've just finished a programme where we took £1 million out of our management by restructuring our management and reducing costs in that way. So there are two main initiatives that we've undertaken in order to deliver a 6.8 million overall saving on staffing over those years. Another way that we believe we've been responsible in terms of rising to the challenge is around procurement. So we've undertaken much broader procurement initiatives. So we've partnered up with many other public sector organisations in order to generate leverage and buy things cheaper through those economies of scale. Another within procurement was around our setting up a company we called Optalis to provide adult social care services, and therefore we contracted with them, and through some really efficient work that they've done, we've managed to work with them and secure contractual savings for that part of our business. So that was another example of where we floated that into the private sector and we bought it in at cheaper than it was initially floated. Targeting our services has been a key consideration of ours in making sure that the books balance. And that has good examples of targeting services. One was around the youth and children's centres work. We saved £570,000 by looking at where we make the biggest intervention, the best benefit for the community around those activities in youth and children's centres. And we believe, and we have some data to show that actually the performance and the appreciation of these services have increased. And in some cases we work with the towns and parishes to ensure that we maintain a generic offering as well as the target offering that we clearly intended to do by making this efficiency. Something else we do in targeting services is we look where we make the biggest impact, and this is around preventative agenda, looking about how we can either intervene early or intervene in a really smart way to prevent escalating care needs escalate to the point that there's a bad experience for the client and indeed a costly experience for the council. So we've been very conscious of if we invest our money wisely and target our resources widely, we can make a big difference by doing things in a different way and catching things at their inception as opposed to when the need has escalated to a high cost and a bad outcome position for the client. Income generation is something we've applied ourselves to as well. Examples would be the green waste. Other examples would be charging utility companies in order to undertake work on our roads. But we're constantly looking ways to bring in income whereby the resident or indeed the contractor has discretion about whether they pay us or not, but that money comes in order to alleviate the pressure on the council taxpayer, yourselves, or indeed enable us to provide ongoing funding to much needed services. In terms of an example of other would be undertaking an asset rationalisation programme whereby we now occupy less footfall, we occupy less premises, and we made savings and efficiencies by undertaking this rationalisation programme and encouraging people to work in a kind of way that meant that we needed less space and therefore freed up building costs and indeed realised capital receipts as well out of that initiative. Now, although that 31.3 million wasn't a complete cut out of our base budget, some of it went back into our growing statutory demand-led markets, like our adult social care provision, like our increasing cost of waste collection and disposal. They've had to go back to fund those unavoidable escalating costs. However, even if you recognise the fact that we've had to plough some of that 31.3 million back into our services, we have still achieved 23.8 million real terms reduction in expenditure from 2010-11 to 2015-16 and managed to fund an increasing client base with higher costs and higher volumes. We think we've managed to do that in the main by improving service performance as well and by maintaining a productive workforce. So that's where we are now. And now it's about really looking at the challenge ahead, which is the key purpose of why we're here. And if you look at those slides there, you'll see that again, this is quite typical. We have a £7 to £8 million pressure projected over the next 3 years. We're expecting about a £4 million reduction in our grant. That is a fairly consistent trend over the years. In previous years, we've had about 4 million of grant taken out of our funding by the government. In addition, we have inflation. We try to control and contain inflation where we can, but some of it is unavoidable, and therefore we have to factor some small amount of inflation in our growth pressures. And then we have that service growth. And I've already alluded to before that a lot of the service growth comes from adult social care, increasing client numbers and increasing cost as clients live more elderly and their care packages become more complex and more expensive. And I think there are some stats out there that say our over 85s will double over the next 5 to 10 years. So that's the kind of dynamics that we're looking at. So some of these pressures are not going to go away. Well, indeed, in many surveys that the government undertakes, if you live at Wokingham, in Wokingham Council, you will live longer than anywhere else in the country, which is a good thing on one hand, but an expensive thing from a council's funding perspective.
You can thank us later.
Sorry?
That's the air pollution doesn't get you first.
Oh, indeed, of course, but the air pollution, well, yes, well, we're looking at the factors around longevity. Some of the stats show that on balance, Wokingham Borough Council is a generally healthy place to live. But of course, it's not without its issues to address. The 1% in council tax represents £800,000. This is not there to indicate that there's a 10% increase in council tax coming your way. We wouldn't do that to you. And indeed, we know we would have to go out to referendum over 2% anyway. We will continue to take a responsible approach to this, and we'll look to find ways through the ones that I've already put up, but also ways on the balls, on the stalls, and indeed your own ideas about how we can bridge this gap over the next 3 years.
Is there not increased revenue on the council tax from the new strategic development sites, or is that swallowed up or counteracted with the government grant we get?
Good question. That line there, tax-based growth, is that very thing. So we have offsetting those very significant pressures above. We have quite a modest amount coming in, well, 700,000 to 1 million, and growing as we increase in terms of those housing numbers, but it is quite small in relation to the pressures that are there. We'll go, sorry, that gentleman.
So we're building 10,000, I think it's 10,300 houses. Presumably most of them are supplying £1,500 a year of council tax, if not more. If that tax-based growth, surely there must be 2,000 or 3,000 houses in there which would come to more than £1 million of tax.
Yeah, this is cumulative, so this is 0.7, then another 0.9.
700,000 houses, £1,500 a go, isn't it? Houses. We're building 10,000 houses over how many years? 5 years, is it? So that must be 2,000 houses a year. And 2,000 houses must be close to £1 million of tax revenue, surely.
Yeah, we're exactly right. We are looking at all the houses in terms of when they're built and the volume. We put in a little bit of amount in terms of caution because we're not wholly in control of these developments are made. But these figures are cumulative, so this is effectively saying...
Yeah, well, that seems very low. I mean, at £1,500, we pay £1,800 tax a year. 10,000 houses, when they're all in, is nearly £12 million, if not more. Probably 15.
And when we come to that full trajectory, we'll have that full amount in. So this is about.
What's the tax?
Sorry, selling it.
I'm not
This
sure
is based on a cautious judgment about the speed at which the houses get built. It's the gap between the developments that have consent and the speed at which the developers get on site.
How cautious is it? Because I mean, based on the sort of numbers I would be thinking that figure has grown by 2 or 3 million a year at least.
Well, it's more cautious than that.
Underspent. Or overspent.
Well, it's certainly a more cautious estimate than that.
Yeah. Do you not agree that you're incredibly cautious with that estimate? You've given permission for these houses to be built. Surely they're going to start generating revenue quickly.
And we adjust our numbers to reflect the speed at which those houses are getting built. So this is, if you like, a snapshot based on current rates, and will change as we go on assessing the speed at which the various developments are taking place.
You can make £1 million cuts, and you don't need to if these figures are present at the estimate.
Yeah, what I can assure you is these figures are always being reviewed, and therefore, and we will have to set our council tax base on a statutory calculation on the actual projections through evaluation office, etc. So there's a very prescriptive way in which this figure will come through, and we'll always keep it under review. So if we are underestimating, then that will indeed help the position. This is just our best estimate at the moment, but it will be reviewed on an ongoing basis. Sorry, can I just take the question over here, because this lady's had her hand up for...
On the same subject, just to understand, the more council tax then that you generate, does that increase the reduction in the grant that you get from the central government? Does it have an impact? Because with the previous slide where you showed 24% against, so the more that you generate in council tax, does that mean that affects what you get from central government in that grant?
No, central government makes separate decisions about the level of grant that it funds. So, council tax receipts rise either by having more people paying council tax or people paying more council tax. The government reductions don't assume anything about Wokingham in either of those contexts. But it does. But because there's the cap beyond which you can only raise council tax with a referendum supporting it, that's what creates the risk in terms of the gap. And part of that risk is mitigated by the income of growth through council tax receipts, as well as other income where we can raise other income.
So do you have like an upper limit what you think that figure could be? Because that seems to us what seems to be quite important in this discussion, if this figure has been put in as well. And we're saying that 10,000 houses could generate £15 million of additional council tax over 5 years. But, I think that figure could be quite considerably higher than that.
So did you want to... Councillor Jorgensen, do you want to...
I just wanted to check your assumptions, because I presume that the same assumption is used on the growth of council tax income as is used on the growth of expenditure caused by the extra people. So if you build 10,000 more houses, not only will your tax base increase, but also your costs will increase. You've used the same assumption on both sides of the equation.
Yes, that's true. We look at the expenditure driven by those increase in houses and indeed the income as well. It's a fair question in terms of the accuracy of the figure. Some of it's informed by previous years and current progress. So we're looking at a lot of things in terms of how accurate is that figure. What I guess I can assure you, is that will be an actual calculation, and it will be incorporated as its specific calculation into our overall requirements. So if that figure's bigger, then you're absolutely right. We will not be making the level of savings elsewhere that we otherwise would be.
And the cost would go up proportionally anyway, because for instance, you've got the road outside, you wouldn't increase the cost of maintaining that road because there's more people, it'd still be the same, so you've got more income, the costs go up only slightly.
Absolutely right.
You can take that into account.
Oh, without a doubt, the economies of scale works in our favour.
Yeah.
That's correct. Sorry, there was a lady over there.
There was a question over there, and the question was, are we selling off all the green...
I'm asking about the amount of houses being built in Wokingham and green land is going. Does this land belong to the council and selling off? Are they to build more houses?
If that were true, our income generation column would be substantially taller and we probably wouldn't need to be here. So no, largely speaking, the land on which housing is built is not owned by the council.
No.
The council's responsibility is as the planning authority, making the planning decisions. The land is owned by a variety of different individuals, families, developers, who then bring sites forward for approval, and when they get approval, then eventually they start to build the houses on. Let's press on, because some of these questions you'll be able to take to our assembled experts dotted around the room.
Yes, maybe just one final one from the...
Yeah, I think the presentation was good, Graham. It's sort of biblical proportions, isn't it? And I think Joseph and his many-coloured coat came to mind. But one of the things that you have to ask is, if each unitary authority has made such really good savings, why don't we now bring them all together and have Berkshire County Council and have the inherent savings in that?
Yes, and indeed that's one of the questions on the slides under governance and resources. So if you've got thoughts about whether it's a Berkshire County Council or indeed a more modest sharing or particular types of sharing, then indeed put your thoughts down on that, because that we know that's very much
around that whole scale political reorganisation. It's a question that you would want to direct at the elected members in the room rather than the politically neutral officers.
Just a point of information, could that be, if all the other councils agreed, could they do that, or would the central government say it's their decision, not going to have a county council?
I think theoretically, in the current climate where government's pushing hard the notion of combined authorities, there is no hypothetical obstacle to that happening at scale if it can be made to make sense politically, economically, and in all those other ways, in a way that can give confidence that, as we need to now, where we're already sharing services with other boroughs, that it's not to the detriment of the people of Wokingham or of the people of the Royal Borough, with whom we share a number of services already. But there are active discussions at both an officer and a political level about that very question. Not about let's reinvent Berkshire. I don't think any of the politicians are having that discussion, but about where we can A, share more services and at greater scale than we already do, and what a combined authority model might look like that delivers some of these efficiencies.
Which brings us on to the final slide for now, before you move into your stalls. And this is intended to show your council tax in terms of if you're a Band D payer, and we are required to equate everything to Band D. And it shows the incidence of expenditure over the services you receive. So you'll see that the services you receive, the most costly, are around health and well-being. 39% of the overall council's budget is spent on the elderly social care. You may know people who receive such a service. A lot of our population, increasing part of our population, are receiving services from adult social care providers. And you'll see that environment, 26%, is the next significant, and the most sizable cost within that is waste collection, waste disposal, and of course I'm sure you all receive such a service, indeed on a weekly basis, I understand, which is a higher threshold than many other councils up and down the country.
So, in essence, this is where your money goes. This, as you go round, you'll see is broken down further. So, what is it in relation to the vulnerable children in this borough that your money contributes to? What is it in relation to adults with additional needs and support needs? What is it that we need to spend money on? How do we do it? How can we, across all of these domains, make savings, make good on our commitments to deliver a balanced budget and preserve the services to our communities that we're charged with doing? I just want to go back on the basis of having had a phone conversation with my wife, who was stuck in traffic on the M1 as I was coming over here, was saying that there was something in the news this evening about a number of authorities declaring themselves feeling at risk in terms of being able to set a viable budget for themselves next year. I don't believe we were one of those authorities. We'll be relieved. I'm relieved to hear.
So you just believe or you know you're not?
I know we're not. Yeah, I know we're not. One of the responses to that in the press was the idea that local authorities are sitting on £22 billion. So how can they be hard up? And I was aware some of you may have heard this on your way in, so I thought I'd try and address it. If you equate the 22 billion to the slide we showed you earlier, it's essentially the 90 million pounds there. It's capital money that pays for capital schemes, and it's not readily available to support the ongoing running costs of the council. And where we hold a reserve, which we have a statutory prudential responsibility to do, again, £1 million out of the reserves that avoids us having to make £1 million of savings gets us out of the hole but for 1 year. Because if you keep going back, eventually your cupboard is bare. So that's the context. If you've got specific questions in relation to the presentation, Graham and myself are happy to be picked off. Otherwise, I'll just guide you again. Health and well-being are over there, environment in that corner, governance and resources, and children's services. Claire.
I was just going to make a suggestion that there's no blank for people that come up with wonderful ideas to be able to put them.
Oh, I thought there was. We'll turn one round. We will make sure that there is a blank piece of paper somewhere for the ideas that we haven't yet had, but will do after tonight.
Before we finalise, can I just ask one other question, which I suspect isn't included on your figures here, and it may become a social pariah for others, but I think it needs to be asked. Mr Cameron was committed to take the most vulnerable people from Syria and disperse them out into various authorities.
Yeah.
I estimated that would cost about, I think I read it in the Times, the actual cost of each individual could be £50,000 per year. And talking to yourself, I think it could be quite considerably higher. I don't know how many people we've committed to taking in this area, but presumably these numbers could be considerably worse. I mean, one lady I believe was asking us to take 50 people. That's £2.5 million a year. It's going to make an even bigger hole than the numbers we've got. So we could do a lot of heart searching here and find that I believe David Cameron has only agreed to fund these people for 1 year. So I'd kind of like to know where we stand on this.
Okay.
We could find ourselves an even bigger hole in 2 or 3 years' time.
All right, well, where we stand is this. We are not in any way geared up to take, receive and support 50 families. That's a huge number that only a large authority that's already got an infrastructure in place to work with unaccompanied asylum seekers, asylum-seeking families, could manage. We have been in negotiation with the Home Office about a number. It's a much lower number, it's below 10. And no local authorities have made a firm commitment until such time as we get some assurance that the funding will last beyond 1 year. And that assurance is now coming through.
It's just very right you're saying 10 families or 10 individuals. Because I understood it was £50,000 per individual.
Well, the government will determine the funding. The offer that we made was up to 5 families. And we think we are better equipped to support a small number of families who, by definition, include parents as well as their children and able to look after their children. The costs would be considerably higher if we were taking unaccompanied young people who needed care and support and parenting and all of those things.
Just one point, looking at the charts, the government doesn't seem to have a very good history of working, does it, in actually help with this.
The only comfort we can draw is that it's a national scheme. And it has to be a national scheme in order for the 10,000 that Mr Cameron's committed to during the life of the Parliament to be 20,000 to be honoured. So we will be one of a number who are all saying we're willing to make a contribution, but we need to see the colour of your money.
It's really, we've been asked to make some huge decisions here about the health of the elderly, the health of children, whether we have, I mean, I found it flattened rats at the back of our house the other day. I think it's been run over by one of the grass cutters. So we certainly
multifunctional.
So
I've always found flattened rats better than the rounded ones.
And I don't think we can really afford to make too more. So if there's further pressure on those numbers,
I think we've tried to make no secret of the fact that because so much of what we do is demand-led, in a local context, we can't, with any confidence, know that there isn't going to be ongoing pressure on some of these numbers. Our discussions with government about refugees is about a very small number, staggered over the period, and on the basis of an adequate funding model being agreed. And that's the consistent position that local government's taking across
that your decision or the council's decision? That's how we take. Who makes the decision at the end of the day?
Ultimately, it will be the councillors.
Should the councillors say something? So
I'm quite sure the councillors will say something if asked.
I can, as leader, the buck stops with me again. The soundings I've had, and bear in mind we've got 54 councillors, the soundings I've had amongst the majority, certainly members of my party, is absolutely consistent with what Andy's saying. So, I can't give you a cast-iron guarantee that that's what will end, because we're a democratic group of councillors who will make that decision. But my soundings at the moment is it's absolutely consistent with the approach that Andy's just said.
I think the other thing to add is that there's overwhelming support being expressed through the council already from church groups, the voluntary sector, in terms of the readiness to provide support from that source as well. So I don't think we envisage this simply being a matter of a cost to Wokingham taxpayers. We envisage it being a cost to UK taxpayers, supported by the local generosity of community groups who want to be able to make a contribution. Okay.
Excuse me. One thing I want to point to you about the roads. When they do the roads, they never come to do it properly. It has to be done. Does this cost the council more money for it to be done when it's back where it shouldn't go?
What I would like to do in response to that is to point you into the far corner of the room where you'll find people who are absolutely able to answer that question. Feel free to mingle, ask, scribble, talk to us, and feel free to help yourself to coffee outside, and when you're done, feel free to leave.